The law is often enforced by authority, but history shows that the simple act of taking a life often unleashes a public reckoning far greater than the officer. And at number 10, we unravel the story of a wealthy 73-year-old reserve deputy who claimed he confused his revolver for a taser. It sounds like an impossibility, a tragic mistake, but the question remains, was this an accident of confusion or the inevitable consequence of a system that allowed the rich to literally buy their way into a position of lethal power? Stay tuned, because the ensuing investigation revealed a deeper institutional scandal involving falsified training records and a department that looked the other way. Like this video now if you demand accountability in policing, and subscribe to make sure you don't miss the ultimate betrayal at number 1. Number 10. Robert Charles Bates, the Reserve Deputy and the Taser Myth. The date, April 2, 2015. The target, Eric Harris, a 44-year-old unarmed black man. The perpetrator, Robert Charles Bates, a 73-year-old Tulsa County Reserve Deputy. The concept of a reserve deputy in Tulsa County, Oklahoma in the mid-2010s was one of quiet, almost genteel policing. These were often wealthy, civic-minded citizens who donated their time, money, and sometimes their exotic tactical gear to the sheriff's department. Robert Charles Bates was the quintessential example of this system. A successful white insurance executive, Bates was known for his generous donations of equipment, vehicles, and thousands of dollars in cash to the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office, TCSO. In return for his philanthropy, Bates was granted the ultimate privilege, the badge, a gun, and the authority of the state. He was a part-time officer, a volunteer with a license to kill, whose charitable donations seemed to overshadow any requirement for rigorous, up-to-date training. This was the dangerous reality on April 2, 2015. The incident began as an undercover sting operation targeting Eric Harris, who was suspected of illegally selling guns. When the operation went sideways, Harris fled from the investigators. What followed was a chaotic, high-speed foot pursuit through a Tulsa parking lot, captured on the sunglasses camera worn by Bates himself. Harris, unarmed, was quickly tackled to the ground by multiple deputies. As officers struggled to control him, the 73-year-old Bates arrived on the scene, panting and out of breath. The visual evidence, clear on his own camera, showed the ensuing fatal seconds. As Harris lay pinned face down on the asphalt, struggling and yelling, Bates moved to assist. He reached for the weapon on his vest. He intended to use his taser, a bright yellow electronic control weapon, standard issue for non-lethal deployment. But he didn't pull the taser. Instead, he drew his personal sidearm, a black, steel, high-powered Smith & Wesson .357 revolver. The confusion, known in police training as a weapon confusion error or slip and capture, played out in agonizing slow motion. Bates pointed the lethal weapon at Harris, who was completely immobilized by other officers, and fired a single, deafening shot. The bullet slammed into Harris's back just below the armpit. The chaos on the audio track instantly shifted to horror. "Oh, I shot him, I'm sorry," Bates immediately exclaimed, the sound of his panicked voice echoing across the feed. He realized his catastrophic, irreversible mistake the instant the recoil hit his hand. Eric Harris, bleeding out on the pavement, cried out, "He shot me! Oh my God, I can't breathe!" He begged the officers to understand what had happened. One officer standing over the dying man responded with chilling callousness, telling Harris, "Fuck your breath." Harris died approximately 1 hour later in the hospital. The man arrested for the crime, however, was not the career criminal the sting had sought, but the volunteer deputy who held the trigger. The revelation of the sunglasses camera footage triggered the first public outrage. The video was impossible to spin. It clearly showed an unarmed man being subdued, an officer arriving late, and a lethal mistake made with an absolute lack of control. But the true twist of the Bates case was not the shooting itself, it was the institutional cover-up it exposed. The sheriff's office initially defended Bates, using what investigators call authority bias to shield him. Their official spokesperson claimed Bates suffered from a phenomenon called slips and capture, a cognitive error where a trained professional intending one action performs another due to stress. They argued it was a tragic but excusable mistake. This defense quickly crumbled. Journalists and independent investigators dug into Bates' employment file, and what they found pointed not to an accident, but to a corrupted system. Bates's training records, the documents that supposedly certified him to carry a firearm and operate a taser, were discovered to be falsified. Internal documents revealed that senior officers within the TCSO knew Bates was grossly unqualified and that he had received preferential treatment due to his massive financial contributions. The investigation revealed that the department was essentially letting wealthy donors pay to play cop. The scandal was not just about one old man making a mistake, it was about the deliberate endangerment of the public by a department that had traded safety for sponsorship. In April 2015, Robert Charles Bates was charged with second-degree manslaughter. His trial, held in 2016, became a national referendum on the two-tiered justice system that seemed to exist for law enforcement. The jury, however, saw past the slips and captured defense. They saw the wealthy donor, the unqualified officer, and the life lost to negligence. Bates was convicted of second-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 4 years in prison. The verdict was a rare moment of accountability, proving that the badge, even a volunteer one, could not entirely shield an individual from the consequences of criminal negligence. The tragic irony of the Robert Bates case is that the officer knew he had made a mistake the instant the gun fired. But what happens when the shot is intentional, yet equally devastating? A bullet fired into an empty darkness that ricochets and kills an innocent bystander, followed by a betrayal of duty so profound that the officer prioritized his own shock over the dying man's life. Next, we journey to New York to uncover the story of Peter Liang, the rookie whose panic led to death and whose failure to act exposed the shocking lack of preparedness in one of America's largest police forces. If this case has exposed your curiosity, hit the subscribe button now and let me know in the comments which case shocked you more, the deliberate cover-up of training or the failure to render aid. Number 9. Peter Liang, the deadly ricochet in the dark. The Louis Pink houses in the East New York neighborhood of Brooklyn were not a friendly place. They were a cluster of neglected public housing buildings, often plagued by unreliable lighting, rising crime, and a deep distrust of authority. The NYPD's response to such areas was often to deploy vertical patrols, a term for officers walking the dark, vertical shafts of the stairwells to deter crime. This practice was part of the controversial Project Impact, which sent young, inexperienced rookie officers like Peter Liang into high-crime precincts. Peter Liang was a 28-year-old first-generation Chinese-American officer just a year out of the academy. He was tasked with patrolling the 8th floor of a building in the Pink houses. He was nervous, inexperienced, and walking a dark hallway with his partner, Sean Landau, on the bitter night of November 20th, 2014. The lack of light in the stairwell was not a simple maintenance issue. It was a deadly hazard. It created an environment of tension and hypervigilance, a zero-sum situation where every noise was a potential threat. Liang and his partner entered the stairwell. Following standard procedure for a dangerous environment, Liang drew his weapon, a 9mm Glock pistol. He held it in one hand, pointed downward, and a flashlight in the other. It was, as he would later testify, a sheer terror and adrenaline. At that exact split second, 28-year-old Akai Gurley, a man who had simply been visiting his girlfriend in the complex and was using the staircase because the elevator was broken, opened the door one floor below, on the 7th floor landing. In the pitch black, the sound of the door opening was amplified. Liang later claimed that the sudden noise startled him. His finger, tense on the trigger, involuntarily contracted. The gun discharged. It was a single, unplanned shot into the darkness. The bullet was never meant to hit anyone. It followed a nightmare trajectory. It slammed into a wall of the stairwell, ricocheted at a sharp angle, and then struck Akai Gurley directly in the chest. Gurley, fatally wounded, stumbled down the stairs.
His friend, Melissa Butler, desperately tried to help him. Up on the 8th floor, Liang and Landau heard the gunshot, followed by the terrifying sound of a body hitting the ground and the subsequent cries. This was the first twist, the accidental shooting. But the second, unforgivable betrayal was the failure to act. For 4 agonizing minutes, the 2 officers, trained, armed, and charged with protecting the public, stood frozen in panic. They argued about whether to call for help. Instead of rushing down the stairs to check on the victim, Liang and Landau reportedly panicked, focusing on the bureaucratic disaster that had just unfolded. Liang, in his state of shock, initially contacted his supervisor, texting him about the discharge before calling in the actual shooting. Meanwhile, Melissa Butler, untrained and terrified, was left to attempt CPR
on Akai Gurley, frantically taking instructions from a neighbor shouting through the phone to a 911 operator. When the officers finally did descend, Gurley was losing consciousness. Liang did not administer aid, claiming he was not properly trained in CPR for a gunshot wound, a devastating claim for a sworn police officer. Akai Gurley was pronounced dead shortly after. The backlash was immediate. While some argued the shot was a tragic accident of a tense environment and poor lighting, a result of departmental negligence, prosecutors focused on the officer's actions after the shooting. The indictment was not just for the fatal shot, but for official misconduct, the dereliction of duty in the aftermath. The trial in 2016 became a national conversation about police training, race, and responsibility. The jury agreed with the prosecution. Peter Liang was found guilty of second-degree manslaughter and official misconduct. The conviction was hailed as a major victory for accountability, a rare instance where an accidental shot led to criminal charges. The fallout, however, was complex. Liang, a Chinese-American officer, became the focal point for 2 different narratives, one demanding justice for a black victim and another arguing that the system only holds minority officers accountable for accidental deaths while white officers escape. The verdict triggered massive protests from the Asian American community, arguing that Liang was a scapegoat for the systemic failures of the NYPD's poorly planned vertical patrols. In the end, the judge showed leniency, reducing Liang's manslaughter conviction to criminally negligent homicide and sentencing him to 5 years of probation and 800 hours of community service, avoiding prison time. The conviction stood, but the sentence added another layer of controversy to a case built on a dark, fatal ricochet. The Gurley case remains a testament not just to the dangers of poor training, but to the ethical line that officers cannot cross. The choice in the moment of panic to protect the badge over preserving the life it was meant to save. The case of Peter Liang showed how institutional negligence can lead to tragedy, but when negligence is swapped for outright calculated malice, the results are far more destabilizing. Next, we uncover a story that begins not with a panicked shot, but with a deliberate, documented pattern of predatory behavior. This case involves a decorated officer who used his badge as a hunting license, specifically targeting the most vulnerable women in the community for sexual assault, believing his authority made him untouchable. But the one thing he couldn't control was his first victim's courage, who kept talking until the system was forced to listen. We will break down the chilling evidence and the 263-year sentence handed to Daniel Holtzclaw. But first, comment below if you think the reduced sentence for Liang was an injustice. Number 7. Daniel Holtzclaw, the badge as a weapon of predation. The date, 2013 to 2014. The target, 13 black women, most with previous criminal records. The perpetrator, Daniel Holtzclaw, Oklahoma City police officer. The city of Oklahoma City hired Daniel Holtzclaw despite a past history of misconduct in a previous police role. On the surface, he looked like a committed officer, young, driven, and seemingly eager to serve. But Holtzclaw, a white officer patrolling a predominantly black, low-income district, quickly began to operate with an assumption of utter impunity. He recognized a terrifying strategic advantage in the women he encountered, women who were often in vulnerable positions, often with minor criminal backgrounds, and women he assumed society would not believe. This was the genesis of his pattern of predation. He used the power of his badge as a hunting license. The process was methodical and sickeningly calculated.
He would initiate traffic stops or pedestrian checks, often citing minor infractions. He would then, on isolated streets and with his body-worn camera mysteriously disabled, escalate the encounters. He would threaten the women with arrest, with planting drugs, or with charges that would revoke their probation. He would then demand sexual favors, knowing the terrifying power dynamic he commanded. His calculation was flawless for a time. He believed that even if one of these women spoke out, her testimony would be dismissed, her word pitted against a police officer's word. The system he banked on would protect the badge, regardless of the person wearing it. The betrayal was twofold. It was a physical assault on a citizen and the ultimate corruption of the office itself. Holtzclaw was using the legal immunity granted by the state to commit serial rape. For nearly a year, his scheme worked. But then, on June 18, 2014, Holtzclaw pulled over a 57-year-old woman in the middle of the night. Unlike the others, this victim, a woman with the courage to believe in a justice system that had often failed her, refused to be silenced. She went directly to the authorities, and against all odds, her story was not dismissed. The investigation that followed was a slow, painful reckoning. Holtzclaw's DNA, evidence from his duty vehicle, and the sheer volume of corroborating testimony from the victims began to paint an undeniable portrait of a serial predator. As the word spread, more and more women who had been silenced by fear and shame began to come forward. The total number of victims reached 13. The trial, held in 2015, became a lightning rod for the discussion of racial bias and sexual violence within policing. The defense attempted to discredit the victims, arguing they were unreliable due to their socioeconomic status and past records. But the prosecution expertly wove together the patterns of his stops, the location data, and the devastating DNA evidence. The jury rejected Holtzclaw's assertion of innocence. On December 10, 2015, Daniel Holtzclaw was convicted on 18 counts, including first-degree rape, sexual battery, and forcible sodomy. The sentence was historic and definitive: 263 years in state prison. It was a term designed to send a clear message that the badge offers no protection for criminal predation, and that the victims of police sexual violence will be believed and avenged. The conviction was a victory for the women who had endured his terror, proving that the word of a courageous victim can, and sometimes must, overpower the code of silence. The Holtzclaw case showed how the depth of criminal intent, a malice that cannot be mistaken for an accident. But sometimes the betrayal is purely defensive, a massive institutional effort to cover up a single fatal shot. Next, we journeyed to the quiet suburbs of Virginia to witness the years-long denial following the shooting of John Gear, a man who stood in his own doorway with his hands raised. The officer's lies were protected by the department for nearly 2 years, forcing the public, the courts, and even the victim's family to fight for the mere release of basic facts. We break down the details of the cover-up and the eventual plea deal. But first, tell me in the comments, what is the single most important reform needed to prevent officers like Holtzclaw from abusing their power?
Number 7. Adam Torres, the hands-up betrayal. The date, August 29, 2013. The target, John Geyer, an unarmed 46-year-old white man. The perpetrator, Adam Torres, Fairfax County, Virginia police officer. The confrontation that ended John Geyer's life was not a pursuit, a high-stakes arrest, or a dangerous raid. It was a domestic dispute call in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Springfield, Virginia. John Geyer had been arguing with his partner, Maura Harrington, and was reportedly distraught. When officers arrived, Geyer was standing just inside the open door of his home, talking to them. He was not aggressive, but emotional. Crucially, the situation had been contained. For nearly 40 minutes, a tense but nonviolent standoff ensued. Geyer was talking to the officers, trying to resolve the situation, and by multiple accounts, he had his hands raised, resting on the top of the door frame or held up in a visible manner. This detail, the hands-up posture, would become the defining and most devastating element of the cover-up. Then, Fairfax County officer Adam Torres, a 7-year veteran, fired his weapon. A single shot. It struck John Geyer in the chest, killing him instantly in his own doorway, in view of his family and neighbors. Torres's initial account,
The one that would be officially sanctioned by the Fairfax County Police Department for almost 2 years was a textbook defense. The officer feared for his life. Geyer had lowered his hands and posed an imminent threat. This narrative was intended to justify the use of deadly force and protect Torres from immediate scrutiny. But the story began to unravel immediately, not because of video, but because of the other police officers on the scene. Multiple witnesses, including other officers, contradicted Torres's account, stating unequivocally that Geyer's hands were up and that he had not lunged or threatened the officers when the fatal shot was fired. The most shocking aspect of the Geyer case was not the shooting, but the institutional silence that followed. For 18 months, the Fairfax County Police Department stonewalled the investigation. They refused to release the basic facts of the case, the internal reports, or the names of the officers involved, claiming an ongoing investigation. This deliberate obfuscation forced the Geyer family to file a civil lawsuit just to obtain the truth about their son's death. It took the intervention of a U.S. senator and a direct order from a federal judge to finally pry the facts out of the police department's grip. This level of institutional refusal, the deliberate act of hiding the truth from the public and the victim's family for over a year, was an ultimate act of organizational betrayal. When the truth finally emerged, it was clear. John Geyer was killed while posing no threat. In August 2015, over 2 years after the shooting, Adam Torres was finally fired. He was indicted on a charge of second-degree murder, the gravity of the charge reflecting the premeditation implied by shooting an unarmed man with his hands in the air. In April 2016, to avoid a high-profile trial that would force his own daughters to testify and drag the family through the agonizing details, John Geyer's family, through the prosecutor, agreed to a plea deal. Adam Torres pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to a year in jail. The Geyer case remains a powerful symbol of how a police department, through the code of silence, can operate to protect its own regardless of the truth. While the sentence was viewed by many as insultingly light for a life taken, the felony conviction itself was seen as a crucial step, the official rejection of the self-serving narrative and the end of Adam Torres's career as a law enforcement officer. The cover-up in the Geyer case was designed to protect a single officer. But what happens when the cover-up involves multiple officers, a corrupt narcotics unit, a falsified warrant, and the intentional planting of evidence to justify the killing of a 92-year-old woman in her own home? Next, we break down the shocking story of the Kathryn Johnston raid in Atlanta, a crime that exposed the depth of the K within a major city's police force and led to federal convictions for civil rights violations. Like the video and comment if you were surprised by the length of time it took for the truth to emerge in the Geyer case. Number 6. Jason R. Smith, Greg Jr., and Arthur Tesler. The no-knock raid and the planted evidence. The Atlanta Police Department's narcotics unit in the mid-2000s was under intense pressure to produce results, particularly in high-crime areas. This pressure, combined with a toxic culture, fostered an environment where officers began to cut corners, ignore procedure, and eventually manufacture evidence. The target on the night of November 21, 2006, was a residence on Neal Street. The officers, Jason Smith, Greg Jr., and Arthur Tesler, were looking for a fictitious drug dealer at that address. Their search warrant was a no-knock warrant, a controversial legal tool that allows police to enter a home without prior warning. They entered with a riot shield and wearing plain clothes. The warrant was based on a lie. Smith had falsified the affidavit, claiming a confidential informant had bought crack cocaine at the house. In reality, the information came from a coerced statement by a suspect, who gave a random address, the home of 92-year-old Kathryn Johnston, who had lived there for 17 years. The officers used a battering ram to burst through the front door of Kathryn Johnston's home. Kathryn Johnston was a small, elderly woman who lived alone in a high-crime neighborhood. She kept a small, rusty revolver for self-defense. Startled by the sudden, violent breach of her home, she fired one single defensive shot. The officers responded with a fusillade of gunfire. In the blink of an eye, they fired 39 rounds. Johnston was hit 6 times and killed instantly in her own doorway, in view of her family and neighbors. The tragic reality of a botched raid had devolved into murder, but the ultimate betrayal came next. The officers, realizing they had killed a nonagenarian in a home with zero evidence of narcotics, went into full cover-up mood. As the chaos subsided, the officers executed a meticulous, chilling act of deception. Officer Jason Smith, the ringleader, took 3 small plastic bags of marijuana, evidence he was carrying from an unrelated previous arrest, and deliberately planted them on the premises. The officers then immediately began to coordinate their official story, fabricating testimony that they had loudly announced themselves and that Johnston had been a threat. Tesler, who was stationed at the back of the house, was coerced by Smith and Jr. to memorize the fabricated narrative. The plot was a conspiracy to obstruct justice, and it was nearly successful. But the neighbors were immediately suspicious, and the forensic evidence eventually began to contradict the official police report. Federal investigators, called in due to the civil rights implications, started to peel back the layers of the lie. They focused on the impossible facts: the elderly victim, the lack of actual drugs, and the coordinated identical statements from the officers. Facing mounting evidence, the conspiracy finally fractured. Officer Arthur Tesler, fearful of the consequences, broke the code of silence and confessed to the planting of evidence and the conspiracy. His testimony brought the entire corrupt enterprise crashing down. In 2008, all 3 officers pleaded guilty in federal court to conspiracy to violate the civil rights of Katherine Johnston, resulting in her death. Smith and Jr. also pleaded guilty to state charges of voluntary manslaughter and false statements. The sentences reflected the severity of the plot. Smith received 10 years, Jr. 6 years, and Tesler 5 years. The case of Katherine Johnston remains a horrifying example of how an institutional pressure to arrests, combined with the power of the no-knock warrant, can lead to the calculated murder of an innocent person and the subsequent criminal conspiracy to cover it up. The sheer maliciousness of the Johnston case stands in sharp contrast to the next case, but the consequences are equally devastating. We return to the phenomenon of slips and capture, the defense that failed Robert Bates, but this time it is wielded by a veteran officer with 26 years of experience who pulled a black Glock instead of a yellow taser. The killing of Daunte Wright was instant, horrific, and captured entirely on a body camera that recorded the officer's agonizing, self-incriminating admission of the mistake. Next, we examine the shocking body cam footage that defined the trial of Kimberly Potter. But first, if you value the truth being uncovered, take a moment to subscribe and share this video now.
Number 5. Kimberly Potter, the taser gun mistake, caught on video. The date, April 11, 2021. The target, Daunte Wright, an unarmed 20-year-old black man. The perpetrator, Kimberly Potter, Brooklyn Center, Minnesota police officer. The city of Brooklyn Center, Minnesota was already a community on edge. The trial of Derek Chauvin was underway just 10 miles away, and the air was thick with tension over the issue of police accountability. Into this environment, on April 11, 2021, Kimberly Potter, a 26-year veteran officer and field training officer, pulled over Daunte Wright for a minor traffic violation, expired tags, and an air freshener hanging from the mirror. The situation escalated when officers discovered Wright had an outstanding warrant for a gross misdemeanor weapons charge. As they moved to arrest him, Wright slipped back into his car, attempting to flee. This was the critical moment. The scene, captured entirely on Potter's own body-worn camera, showed the desperate struggle as officers tried to pull Wright from the car. Potter drew what she believed to be her taser gun. She shouted the taser warning clearly 3 times, "Taser, taser, taser." But she was not holding the bright yellow, lighter plastic taser. She was holding her black, heavier, lethal 9mm Glock pistol. The sound of the single gunshot was followed by the frantic, self-incriminating confession that would seal her fate. Potter, a seasoned training officer, looked at the gun in her hand and immediately broke down, screaming, "Oh shit, I just shot him. I grabbed the wrong gun."
Wright's car sped away before crashing moments later. Daunton Wright was dead in the driver's seat. The legal defense for Potter relied entirely on the slips and capture phenomenon, the same defense that had failed Robert Bates. They argued that a momentary, high-stress cognitive error led her to confuse her tools. The defense emphasized her 26 years of service and her immediate, visceral reaction of regret. They argued it was a tragic mistake, not a crime. The prosecution countered with a devastating point. A 26-year veteran is trained to differentiate between their lethal and less lethal weapons through tactile distinction, weight, size, color, and routine. They argued her reckless disregard for this training, especially when her finger was on a lethal trigger, constituted criminal negligence. The jury was shown the body camera footage repeatedly, forced to watch the agony of the final seconds and hear the terrible admission. In December 2021, Kimberly Potter was found guilty of first-degree and second-degree manslaughter. The conviction, despite the jury accepting the mistake of the weapon, was a clear statement that an officer's mistake, when it leads to death, must be met with criminal accountability. The sentencing in February 2022 became another point of massive public contention. Potter was sentenced to just 2 years in prison with a requirement to serve 16 months. The judge, in an emotional hearing, accepted that the shooting was an accident, but stressed that her lack of care was a breach of her duty. The sentence, well below the presumptive guidelines, sparked further outrage from the Wright family, who felt the justice system prioritized the officer's remorse over the victim's life. The Kimberly Potter case ultimately cemented a terrifying precedent. An officer's confusion can be lethal, but the ultimate responsibility for pulling the trigger of a weapon rests solely with the officer, regardless of intent. The failures in the Potter case were quick, panicked, and captured on video. But what happens when the failure is not a moment of panic, but one of slow, agonizing inaction, lasting over 9 minutes? We now transition to the most consequential case in modern police history, beginning our final 4 with the role of the rookie officer who stood by and failed to intervene. Next, we analyze the moral and legal failure of Thomas Lane, the officers whose whispered questions to Derek Chauvin expose the deepest rift in the police code of silence. But first, hit the comments section and tell us, was the 2-year sentence for Kimberly Potter an act of mercy or an insult to justice? Number 4. Thomas Lane, the rookies, and the failure to intervene. The date, May 25, 2020. The target, George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man. The perpetrator, Thomas Lane, Minneapolis police rookie officer, aiding and abetting. The murder of George Floyd on May 25, 2020, involved 4 Minneapolis police officers. The 2 rookies on the scene, J. Alexander Kuang and Thomas Lane, were in their first week of actual field patrol. They arrived first at the scene of the counterfeit $20 bill. And Lane was the first officer to interact with Floyd, approaching his USV and drawing his pistol as he told Floyd to show his hands. When the senior, powerful presence of Derek Chauvin arrived, the dynamic shifted entirely. Thomas Lane's most damning role, and the ultimate betrayal of his oath, was his failure to intervene, a critical ethical and legal responsibility for every law enforcement officer. Lane was tasked with controlling Floyd's legs as Chauvin knelt on his neck. As the 9 minutes and 29 seconds of the restraint dragged on, Lane was the only officer who voiced any concern, however tentative. He was recorded on the body camera asking Derek Chauvin twice, "Should we roll him on his side?" And later, "I'm worried about excited delirium or whatever." These questions, whispered under the imposing authority of the senior officer, are the perfect microcosm of the police culture of silence and deference to rank. Lane knew something was wrong. His training told him something was wrong. His moral compass told him something was wrong, but he was physically pinned down by the seniority of the scene. Lane's defense at his subsequent federal trial would hinge on this dynamic. His lawyer argued that he was merely a rookie, following the orders of a superior officer who possessed both authority and overwhelming confidence. They argued that the system, designed to protect the senior man, failed the junior man. The prosecution successfully argued that regardless of rank, the law places a personal duty on every officer to intervene when excessive, unreasonable force is being applied, especially when the subject is clearly losing consciousness and pleading for life. Lane had a duty to intervene and a duty to provide medical care, and he failed on both counts. His inaction, they argued, made him a culpable participant. In February 2022, Thomas Lane was convicted in federal court of depriving George Floyd of his civil rights by showing deliberate indifference to his serious medical needs. The federal conviction was a powerful message that passive participation in brutality is still criminal. In May 2022, Lane agreed to a plea deal on the state charge of aiding and abetting second-degree manslaughter, avoiding a high-profile trial. As part of the agreement, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, which would be served concurrently with his federal sentence. The plea agreement was a clear act of taking responsibility, a small measure of accountability that separated him from his more defiant co-defendants. The story of Thomas Lane is a devastating cautionary tale about complicity. The system that forces officers to follow rank, regardless of the consequences, is a system that betrays the public trust. His whispered questions revealed his doubt, but his physical presence confirmed his ultimate, fatal decision to stand down. Thomas Lane's inaction cost him his career and his freedom. But what happens when an officer's lie about the scene is completely and utterly debunked by a single, unsolicited video from a passing bystander? We now journey to South Carolina to witness the killing of Walter Scott, a case that became the definitive proof that the civilian video camera is the ultimate antidote to the police code of silence. Next, we break down the critical evidence, the lies, and the federal conviction of Micheal Slager. Hit subscribe now to support our in-depth analyses of these crucial moments in history.
Number 3. Micheal Slager, the running man and the witness's phone. The date, April 4, 2015. The target, Walter Scott, an unarmed 50-year-old black man. The perpetrator, Micheal Slager, North Charleston, South Carolina police officer. Walter Scott was stopped by Officer Micheal Slager on April 4, 2015 for a broken brake light. Scott, who had an outstanding warrant for unpaid child support, panicked. Knowing that a simple traffic stop could land him in jail for a long time, he bolted from his 1991 Mercedes. Slager pursued him on foot into a vacant lot. The scene, as it unfolded, was a textbook example of an officer's narrative being destroyed by a civilian's courage. Slager initially discharged his taser, which temporarily disabled Scott. Scott then got up and crucially began running away from the officer. This is where the betrayal began. Slager drew his service weapon and fired 8 rounds at Walter Scott's back from a distance of 15 to 20 feet. Scott fell face down into the grass. 5 of the 8 bullets found their mark, killing him instantly. Slager immediately radioed in his version of the events. "Shots fired and the subject is down. He grabbed my taser." His subsequent official report was a carefully constructed lie. He claimed he feared for his life because Scott had taken his taser and was a direct threat. This narrative was intended to place the shooting squarely within the legal definition of self-defense. Furthermore, Slager was recorded on his own body camera planting evidence, walking back to the spot of the scuffle, picking up his taser, and then dropping it next to Scott's body to support his fabricated story. The cover-up would have been successful. The shooting ruled justifiable, were it not for a man named Fidene Santana. Santana, who was walking by and witnessed the entire event, pulled out his phone and began recording. His shaky, unsolicited cell phone video captured the moment that defined the case. Walter Scott running away. The video showed Scott, unarmed, fleeing, with Slager in pursuit. It showed Scott falling after the fatal shots. It showed Slager running back to stage the scene. When the video was released to the press, it instantly ripped apart Slager's narrative. His lie was not just contradicted, it was visually, undeniably destroyed. The difference between the officer's report, "I feared for my life as he advanced on me," and the video, "He was running away from me," was the distance between justifiable force and murder. The swift public pressure resulting from the video forced action. Micheal Slager was arrested and charged with murder 3 days after the shooting.
The state murder trial in 2016 resulted in a hung jury, a devastating moment that showed the difficulty of convicting an officer even with irrefutable video evidence. But the federal government stepped in, prosecuting Slager for the separate charge of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, the same federal crime as in the Floyd case. In 2017, Micheal Slager pleaded guilty to the federal civil rights charge. His plea was an admission that he used deadly force even though it was objectively unreasonable. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The case of Walter Scott proved that the greatest check on police power in the modern era is not a body camera controlled by the department, but the ubiquitous cell phone video held by a civilian. It exposed the code of silence and the self-serving narrative for the criminal act it was. The cell phone video was the crucial turning point in the Slager case. But what happens when the dashcam video, the police's own evidence, is intentionally hidden from the public for over a year? Not to protect a single officer, but to protect an entire city administration. Next, we break down the case of Jason Van Dyke and the 16 shots fired into Laquan McDonald, a murder that exposed the highest levels of political corruption in Chicago. Like this video if you believe the civilian camera is the true force for accountability. Number 2. Jason Van Dyke, the 16 shots and the withheld tape. The date, October 20, 2014. The target, Laquan McDonald, an armed 17-year-old black teenager. The perpetrator, Jason Van Dyke, Chicago police officer. The city of Chicago has a long, troubled history with police misconduct. The killing of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald on October 20, 2014 became the ultimate symbol of the city's entrenched code of silence, extending far beyond the police department and into the highest halls of political power. McDonald was walking down a street, armed with a 3-inch folding knife, and had punctured a tire on a police car. He had PCP in his system and was acting erratically. Officers were following him, attempting to contain the situation. When Officer Jason Van Dyke arrived on the scene, he had been there for less than 30 seconds before he exited his vehicle and opened fire. The police report, signed by multiple officers, followed the established pattern. McDonald had lunged at Van Dyke, posing an imminent threat, justifying the use of deadly force. The official story was designed to make the killing justifiable. But the shooting was captured on the dashcam video from one of the police cruisers, and the video told a different story. The footage showed Laquan McDonald walking away from Officer Van Dyke, not lunging. It showed the teenager collapsing after the first shot. And then it showed the devastating, relentless truth. Officer Van Dyke emptied his magazine, firing 16 shots into the teenager's body over 14 seconds, continuing to fire even after McDonald was motionless on the ground. The police, the city administration, and the mayor's office instantly recognized the explosive nature of this video. This was not a quick, regrettable mistake. It was an execution caught on tape. The decision was made. The video would be buried. For 400 days, 13 months, the city of Chicago fought the release of the dashcam footage. The city settled a wrongful death suit with the McDonald family for $5 million, contingent on the video remaining secret. The official excuse was that the release would compromise an ongoing investigation. This delay was the central, unforgivable betrayal. The city administration, facing an election, was prioritizing political stability over public truth. The code of silence had become a political conspiracy. It took a public outcry, a civil lawsuit, and a direct order from a Cook County judge in November 2015 to force the release of the footage. When the footage finally hit the internet, the reaction was immediate. Mass protests, civil unrest, and a demand for a federal civil rights investigation. The video was impossible to deny. That same day, Jason Van Dyke was charged with first-degree murder. The Van Dyke trial in 2018 became a national spectacle. The defense argued that the officer saw the knife and perceived an imminent threat, but the prosecution, aided by the unedited visual evidence, argued that the number of shots and the officer continuing to fire into a prone body demonstrated malice.
The jury found Van Dyke guilty of second-degree murder and 16 counts of aggravated battery. He was sentenced to 6 years and 9 months in prison, a term considered insultingly short by many activists, but the conviction itself was a watershed moment. It proved that a police officer could be convicted of murder for an on-duty shooting, even when protected by an entire city's cover-up. The case led to a major Department of Justice investigation into the Chicago Police Department, forcing a consent decree for widespread reform. The saga of Laquan McDonald exposed the deepest, darkest truth of American policing. The code of silence can be institutionalized, but the truth, once revealed, has the power to bring down both the officer and the administration that sought to protect him. The Van Dyke case was a victory achieved through an agonizing 400-day battle. But the ultimate betrayal, the defining moment that broke the American consciousness, required no lengthy delay, no concealed tape, only the terrible, shared experience of watching an execution unfold, minute by agonizing minute, in real time. We have reached the final case, the singular event that changed policing forever. We now turn to the final 9 minutes that broke the world. Like the video and comment if you believe the Van Dyke verdict was the beginning of true police accountability. Number 1. Derek Chauvin, the 9 minutes that changed the world. The killing of George Floyd. The date, May 25, 2020. The target, George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man. The perpetrator, Derek Chauvin, Minneapolis police officer. The location was the corner of 38th and Seminar on police procedures, physiology, and responsibility. The prosecution dismantled every element of the defense. Expert testimony confirmed that the restraint was not only unauthorized and excessive, but lethal. Even the Minneapolis police chief testified against Van Dyke, a powerful break in the long-held code of silence. The defense's argument that the suspect's underlying medical condition and drug use were the cause of death was ultimately rejected by the jury. The jury understood the critical, undeniable truth shown on the video. The excessive force, the duration of the restraint, and the calculated indifference were the direct cause of death. On April 20, 2021, the jury delivered a verdict of guilty on all 3 charges: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Chauvin was sentenced to 22.5 years in prison on the state charges, followed by an additional 21-year federal sentence for violating George Floyd's civil rights. The convictions and the sentence were not just a measure of justice for George Floyd's family. They were a profound statement of accountability, a legal acknowledgement that the badge does not grant a license to kill with impunity. The murder of George Floyd was the final, devastating chapter in this countdown. It proved that in the age of the cell phone, there is no more room for the shadows of misconduct. The 9 minutes changed the world, shattering the code of silence and forcing a global reckoning with the betrayal of the badge. The descent from 10 to 1 is not merely a catalog of crimes, it is an autopsy of American trust. Each case, from the criminal negligence of Robert Bates to the calculated indifference of Derek Chauvin, reveals a moment when the ultimate authority granted by society was twisted, abused, or fatally misused. These officers were not simply victims of high-stress situations. They were individuals who prioritized their own panic, prejudice, or criminal desires over the sanctity of human life. And the lesson whispered in the aftermath of these betrayals is often the same. The truth will out. In the modern era, the shield of the badge is easily pierced by the light of a cell phone camera, a courageous witness, or a determined prosecutor. The authority bias that once protected these institutions is crumbling under the weight of visual evidence. The stories of Eric Harris, Akai Gurley, Walter Scott, Laquan McDonald, Katherine Johnston, and George Floyd are tragic reminders that the promise of protection is only as strong as the oath taken by the person wearing the uniform. And when that oath is broken, the fallout doesn't just end a life, it changes a nation.
We hope this deep dive into the cost of betrayal has given you a renewed perspective on the fight for accountability. If you found this documentary compelling, make sure to comment below with your thoughts on the lessons learned and hit that subscribe button. By doing so, you support the type of in-depth, retention-driven storytelling that brings these critical histories to light.